I stepped out of a Bentley at my son's wedding, and the room went completely silent. The same people who had spent 25 years calling me the woman who destroyed her own family suddenly stared at me like they had never seen me before. My son's face, my only child Michael, went pale as if he had just seen a ghost, and the truth is, that was exactly what he expected. A ghost from the past. A broken woman he could humiliate in front of everyone he wanted to impress. But that afternoon, when my heels touched the marble steps of that wedding hall, something happened that none of them had planned for. Especially my son. And before I tell you how that moment unfolded, let me ask you something. If a lie about you was repeated for 25 years, would you spend your life trying to defend yourself, or would you wait quietly until the truth had no choice but to reveal itself? If stories like this move you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the strongest lessons in life come from the moments when people underestimate us the most. Now let me tell you how my own son invited me to his wedding, not out of love, but to humiliate me in front of an entire room. My name is Alina Grant. I'm 66 years old. For most of my life, people believed I was the woman who destroyed the Grant family, the woman who ruined a successful company, the woman who abandoned her child. But the truth is much more complicated than that. And it begins with a phone call that I never expected to receive. It happened on a quiet afternoon while I was sitting in my office reviewing property reports. I remember the sunlight falling across the floor of the room, the city stretching out beneath the windows, and the silence that filled the building after most employees had gone home. My phone rang. I almost ignored it. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but something in my chest tightened before I even answered. Instinct, perhaps, or the quiet pull of a bond that never completely disappears. I picked up the phone. Hello, there was a pause, then a voice I hadn't heard in 25 years spoke my name. Alina, not mom, not mother, just my name, cold, distant, controlled. My fingers tightened around the phone. My son, Michael Grant. The boy I had once held in my arms. The boy whose bedtime stories I used to read every night. The boy who had not spoken to me since he was 13 years old. Now he was 38. His voice had deepened, sharpened, hardened. But a mother recognizes her child no matter how many years pass. Michael, I said quietly. Silence followed. A long one, then he spoke again. I'm getting married next month. His tone sounded more like he was announcing a court hearing than sharing joyful news. Saturday the 17th, Davenport Hall. My heart skipped for a moment. My son was getting married, a milestone in his life that most mothers dream about witnessing. For one brief second, hope tried to rise inside me. Perhaps time had softened him. Perhaps he wanted reconciliation. Perhaps the years had finally opened a door between us. Then he continued speaking, and that hope vanished instantly. Claire's family keeps asking about you, he said. Claire Davenport, his fiancée, a woman from a wealthy investment family. I knew her name because my private investigator had mentioned it months earlier. They've heard stories, Michael continued. Everyone has. They want to see the woman who destroyed her own family. My breathing slowed. I already understood where this conversation was heading. So I thought it would be interesting, he added, if you came to the wedding. His voice carried a hint of amusement. Not kindness, not curiosity, amusement. People deserve to see the truth about you. There it was, the real reason for the invitation. My son wasn't inviting me to celebrate his marriage. He was inviting me to be displayed. Like a cautionary tale, like a public warning. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the city skyline. 25 years earlier, I had walked out of a courthouse with my reputation destroyed and my son taken away from me. And now the same child wanted to present me to the world as the villain of his life story. You can sit quietly, Michael continued. No speeches, no scenes, just be there so everyone can see what kind of person you are. His words were sharp. But they didn't hurt the way they once would have, because time teaches women something important. Pain eventually stops being pain, it becomes understanding. I took a slow breath. What time is the ceremony? I asked calmly. The silence on the other end of the line lasted longer this time. I think he expected anger or tears or refusal. 3 o'clock, he said finally. Good, I replied. I'll be there. Then I ended the call before he could respond. For several minutes I sat perfectly still, not angry, not shocked, just thoughtful. Across the room, framed photographs lined the wall, properties I had renovated, buildings I had purchased, projects that had taken decades of quiet work to build. 25 years ago, I had walked away from everything with nothing but a suitcase and a reputation no one wanted to touch. And now, the world had changed in ways my son could not possibly imagine. A soft knock sounded on my office door. Daniel Reyes stepped inside. Daniel is 52 years old and used to work as a financial crimes detective. Over the years, he had become one of the few people who knew the full story of what happened to me. "You look like you just received interesting news," he said. I turned toward him. "My son is getting married." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That sounds complicated." "He invited me." "That sounds even more complicated." I allowed a small smile. "He intends to humiliate me in front of his fiancée's family." Daniel leaned against the desk. "Do you plan to attend?" I turned back toward the window again. The answer had already formed in my mind. "Yes," I said quietly, "because sometimes the truth doesn't defend itself with arguments." Daniel crossed his arms. "Then how does it defend itself?" I looked at my reflection in the glass. A 66-year-old woman with silver hair and calm eyes looked back at me, a woman the world had once labeled a criminal. A woman who had spent decades rebuilding her life quietly while everyone else believed she had disappeared. "It waits," I said, "and then it walks into the room at exactly the right moment." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then I assume you'll want everything prepared?" I met his gaze. "Yes, because there was something Michael Grant did not know, something his grandmother Victoria Grant had spent decades hiding, something my ex-husband Richard Grant had been too afraid to admit. The scandal that destroyed my life had never actually been about me, and the documents proving it were already waiting in my lawyer's office. But none of them knew that yet, not my son, not the people who hated me, and definitely not the guests who would be attending that wedding. They believed they were about to watch a mother humiliated in front of an entire room. What they didn't realize was that the story they had believed for 25 years was about to collapse in a single afternoon. And when I finally stepped out of that Bentley at the entrance of the wedding hall, my son's expression told me something immediately. He had invited a broken woman, but the woman who arrived was someone he had never met before, and the moment he realized that, everything changed. 25 years ago, before my son Michael Grant grew into the confident corporate attorney the world sees today, he was just a little boy who used to fall asleep on the couch while I balanced checkbooks at the kitchen table. Back then, I wasn't the woman people whispered about in newspapers. I was simply his mother. At that time, I was 39 years old, working as a bookkeeper for the logistics company owned by my husband, Richard Grant. Richard, my husband then, now my ex-husband, was a man the business world respected. Tall, charming, and always perfectly dressed, he had built his company into a regional success. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Behind closed doors, the company was already collapsing. But I didn't know that yet. What I did know was that our son Michael was growing up fast. He had just turned 13, the age where boys begin asking serious questions about the world. He loved math, loved puzzles, and sometimes sat beside me while I worked through the company ledgers. "Mom," he would ask, tapping numbers on a calculator, "how do you always know when something doesn't add up?" I used to smile and tell him something I still believe today. Because numbers tell the truth if you listen carefully. That was before the lies started. The first sign that something was wrong came late one night when I was reviewing the company's financial records. The numbers didn't make sense. Money had been moved between accounts in ways that violated several regulations. Large transfers, missing documentation, strange authorizations. At first I thought it was simply sloppy accounting. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became that someone inside the company had been manipulating the books. And those transactions carried one name over and over again. Richard Grant, my husband. I remember confronting him in our kitchen that night. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. "Richard," I said carefully, sliding the paperwork across the table. "These transfers, they're illegal." He barely glanced at the pages. "Business decisions," he replied. "These could bring federal charges." That was when he looked at me, not with concern, with calculation. "You worry too much, Alina." But I didn't stop worrying. Over the next few weeks, more irregularities appeared. Loans taken under the company's name, Funds moved into accounts I didn't recognize. And every time I questioned it, Richard became more distant, colder. Around the same time, my mother-in-law Victoria Grant began visiting the house more frequently. Victoria Grant was 84 years old now, but even back then she had the presence of a general commanding an army. She had always disliked me. In her mind, I had never been good enough for the Grant family. I still remember the way she used to look at me across the dinner table, like a mistake her son had made. One evening she pulled Richard aside in the living room while I was cleaning up after dinner. Their voices were low, but the tension in the room felt heavy enough to touch. When they came back into the kitchen, Victoria smiled at me. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had already made a decision. And within 3 months, my life collapsed. Federal investigators arrived at the office early one morning. They seized records, computers, financial documents. The company accounts were under investigation for fraud. I remember Michael waiting for me at home that evening, sitting on the stairs. "Mom," he said, "Dad says something bad happened at work." I knelt in front of him. "Everything will be okay," I told him. But inside, I already knew something was very wrong. The investigation moved quickly. Lawyers appeared. Auditors examined the books. And then one afternoon, I was called into a conference room where Richard and Victoria were already waiting. Their attorney sat beside them. I knew before anyone spoke. They had decided who would take the fall. Richard didn't meet my eyes when he said it. The investigators believe the financial irregularities came from the accounting department. The accounting department. Which meant me. "You handled the ledgers," Victoria added calmly. "The responsibility falls there." My chest tightened. "You know I didn't do this." Victoria folded her hands on the table. "Unfortunately, Alina, the records say otherwise." I looked at Richard, my husband, the father of my son. "Tell them the truth," I said, but Richard remained silent. And that silence told me everything. The company was collapsing. If the truth came out, Richard would lose everything. His reputation, his business, his freedom. But if the blame fell on me, the Grant family name would survive. I remember walking out of that room feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. The charges moved forward quickly. Newspapers reported the story. Accounting fraud in Grant Logistics. My name appeared in every article. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors stopped speaking. And the worst part wasn't the humiliation. It was watching the lies reach my son. Michael started asking questions. "Mom, did you steal money?" I tried to explain, but Victoria had already begun her campaign. She told him I had betrayed the family, that I had ruined his father's company, that I had chosen greed over him. And when the court hearings began, the distance between me and my son grew wider with every passing day. One night I found him sitting on his bed staring at the floor. "Michael," I said softly. He didn't look up. "Grandmother says you're going to prison." The words pierced deeper than any accusation. I sat beside him. "I would never hurt you," I whispered. But he didn't answer, because the people he trusted most had already convinced him otherwise. A month later, the trial began, and the moment that destroyed my relationship with my son forever happened inside that courtroom. But the truth about that day, the real truth, is something Michael Grant still doesn't know. Not yet. And the wedding he invited me to is the place where he's finally going to hear it. The day the court announced its decision, the sky outside the courthouse was gray and heavy, as if even the weather understood something terrible was about to happen. I remember standing in that courtroom with my hands clasped tightly in front of me, trying to stay calm while my entire life balanced on the words of strangers. That day I learned something about the world that every woman eventually discovers. Sometimes the truth is not enough to protect you. The courtroom was crowded. Reporters sat in the back rows. Business associates of my ex-husband Richard Grant whispered among themselves. And at the front, sitting beside my mother-in-law Victoria Grant, was my son Michael. He was only 13 years old. Michael Grant, my son, the boy who used to run into my arms when I came home from work, sat stiffly beside his grandmother as if he no longer recognized me. Victoria had dressed him in a navy blazer that day. His hair was combed neatly, and his expression was cold in a way that no child's face should ever look. I tried to catch his eyes across the room, but he wouldn't look at me. That was the first moment my heart began to break. The prosecution painted a very convincing story. They said that as the company's bookkeeper, I had manipulated the records. They said I had hidden losses and moved funds illegally. And every time they spoke my name, they looked directly at the jury as if the case were obvious. But what hurt the most wasn't the accusations. It was the silence of the people who knew the truth. Richard Grant sat only a few feet away from me, my husband of 16 years, the man whose company I had helped manage. The man who knew exactly where those illegal transactions came from. He never once stood up. He never once said, "My wife is innocent." Instead, he stared straight ahead as if I were a stranger. And Victoria Grant, his mother, watched the entire trial with a look of quiet satisfaction. She had orchestrated everything perfectly. By the time the defense began presenting arguments, the damage had already been done. My lawyer tried to explain the inconsistencies in the financial records, but without access to the real documents Richard had hidden, it wasn't enough. The jury returned after only 3 hours. 3 hours, that was all it took to erase my life. The judge read the verdict slowly, guilty. I remember the sound of the word echoing in the room like a hammer striking stone. Somewhere behind me, a reporter began writing quickly in a notebook. I didn't cry, not then, because my eyes were fixed on one person, Michael. My son finally looked at me, but the expression in his eyes wasn't confusion. It was betrayal, the kind that comes from believing someone you loved has destroyed everything. I tried to speak to him as officers approached to escort me away. "Michael," I said softly. But before he could respond, Victoria placed a hand on his shoulder and gently turned him away from me. That moment lasted only a few seconds. Yet it would take 25 years to recover from it. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. Headlines were already forming before the day even ended. Grant Logistics fraud scandal, CEO's wife convicted, corporate bookkeeper sentenced. My name was printed beneath every accusation. Within weeks, my marriage to Richard Grant ended quietly. He filed for divorce while the case was still fresh in the media. Victoria took custody of Michael while I tried to rebuild what little remained of my life. And the boy who once called me mom slowly began believing the version of the story everyone else repeated. A woman who betrayed her family, a woman who destroyed a company, a woman who chose crime over her child. What Michael never knew was that the scandal had been far worse than anyone imagined. Because the missing money, the transactions that destroyed my reputation, had been connected to deals Richard had been hiding for years. Deals that would have destroyed his company completely if they were exposed. Victoria understood that before anyone else did, and she made a decision. If one person had to fall, it would be me. At first, I tried to fight back. I wrote letters to Michael explaining everything. I called the house hoping to speak with him, but Victoria intercepted every attempt. My letters disappeared, my calls were blocked. And slowly, the distance between my son and me became permanent. Years passed. The world moved on. The newspapers stopped writing about Alina Grant. But I never stopped thinking about the boy who used to wait for me at the front door after school. The boy who once told me I was the smartest person he knew. The boy who, by the time he reached adulthood, believed I had abandoned him. For a long time, I wondered if I should have exposed Richard and Victoria immediately. I had enough information even then to cause serious trouble for them. But there was one reason I didn't. Michael. I knew that if his father's company collapsed publicly, it would destroy his future too. And a mother, even one the world calls a criminal, still protects her child. So instead of fighting publicly, I disappeared quietly. I left the city. I left the life that had betrayed me, and I began rebuilding from nothing. But what Richard and Victoria didn't realize was that disappearing gave me something they never expected. Time. Time to learn. Time to rebuild. And time to eventually uncover the evidence that proved exactly who had been responsible for the scandal all along. That discovery wouldn't happen until years later, when a man named Daniel Reyes, a former financial crimes investigator, began digging into the old case. But when Daniel finally showed me what he had found in those records, I understood something very important. The truth about that scandal had been buried for decades, and the people who buried it believed it would stay hidden forever. They were wrong, because the moment my son invited me to his wedding, the clock on those secrets finally started ticking. And by the time that wedding day arrived, the entire Grant family was about to learn exactly what they had done. After the trial ended and the headlines stopped printing my name, I disappeared from the life I once knew. The Grant family continued protecting their reputation, the company quietly reorganized, and society moved on as if the scandal had been solved. But my life had been completely erased. I left the city with one suitcase and the quiet understanding that the world now believed I was exactly the woman the newspapers described. The woman who destroyed a company. The woman who abandoned her child. At first, survival was my only goal. I took the kind of jobs people don't notice. Cleaning offices after business hours. Filing paperwork in small accounting firms that didn't bother looking too closely at my past. For months, I kept my head down, spoke little, and worked more hours than I thought possible. The hardest part wasn't the exhaustion. It was the silence. When you lose your reputation, you also lose the simple conversations that make life feel normal. No one asks about your family. No one asks about your past. And in my case, that silence also meant losing my son. Michael Grant had grown up believing the story everyone told him. In his mind, his mother had destroyed his father's company and disappeared because she couldn't face the consequences. I wondered about him constantly. Did he still play the piano like he used to when he was younger? Did he still leave books scattered around the house? Did he remember the nights we used to sit together solving math puzzles at the kitchen table? Or had Victoria Grant, his grandmother, successfully erased me from his memory? There were nights when those questions nearly broke me, but every time doubt started creeping in, I reminded myself of something important. If I collapsed, the lie would win forever, so I started focusing on something else. Numbers. Numbers had always made sense to me in ways people never did. They reveal patterns, opportunities, weaknesses. One evening while working late in a small accounting office, I noticed something interesting in a stack of property records. A building in a neglected neighborhood had been listed for sale far below its actual market value. Most investors ignored properties in areas like that because they required patience and long-term thinking. But patience was the one thing I had plenty of. I spent weeks researching real estate markets in different cities. I studied zoning changes, property tax structures, renovation costs. Eventually, I saved enough money to purchase my first small property. It wasn't impressive. In fact, it was falling apart. The paint was peeling. The plumbing barely worked. The roof leaked every time it rained. But when I stood inside that building for the first time, something unexpected happened. For the first time since the trial, I felt hope. I renovated that property slowly. I worked during the day and repaired the building at night. It took almost a year to finish everything. When it was finally ready, I rented it out. The income from that property became the seed for the next one, then another, and another. Over the next 15 years, the small investments multiplied. I learned to identify undervalued neighborhoods before other investors noticed them. I partnered with construction teams, negotiated property auctions, and quietly expanded my portfolio. I never appeared in the spotlight. I never advertised my success. The woman society believed had disappeared was quietly building something powerful behind the scenes. By the time I reached my early 60s, I owned dozens of properties across several cities. But despite everything I had built, one question never left my mind. What really happened to the truth? I knew Richard Grant had been responsible for the financial decisions that destroyed his company. I had seen enough evidence during those early days to understand that the scandal was far bigger than the story the court had accepted. But proving it required something I didn't yet have: access to the real financial records. That opportunity appeared years later when I met Daniel Reyes. Daniel was a former financial crimes detective who had spent most of his career investigating corporate fraud cases. We met during a property transaction when he was consulting for a development firm. At first, our conversations were purely professional, but eventually I told him about the case that had destroyed my life. Daniel listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished explaining everything, he leaned back in his chair and said something that caught my attention. "Corporate fraud cases rarely disappear completely," he said. "There are always records somewhere." Within a few weeks, Daniel began quietly investigating the old files connected to Grant Logistics. He reviewed archived financial reports, internal memos, tax filings, anything that had survived the collapse of the company. What he discovered shocked even him. The financial irregularities that led to my conviction had never originated from the accounting department. They had come directly from executive-level transactions authorized by Richard Grant himself. But the most disturbing discovery involved my former mother-in-law, Victoria Grant. Several critical documents had been removed from the official investigation records before the trial. Those documents contained evidence linking Richard to a series of risky investments and hidden debt agreements. Without those documents, the investigation had focused entirely on the accounting department, which meant me. Daniel eventually brought the evidence to Margaret Sloan. Margaret Sloan is a corporate litigation attorney who specializes in reviewing wrongful financial convictions. Calm, precise, and extremely patient, Margaret studied every document Daniel had recovered. After several weeks, she called me into her office. Her conclusion was simple. "You were never responsible for the fraud," she said. I already knew that, but hearing a professional confirm it carried a different weight. Margaret opened a folder on her desk. Inside were dozens of documents. Financial transfers signed by Richard. Internal communications between company executives. Records showing how certain evidence had disappeared before the trial. "This is enough to reopen the case," she explained. I sat quietly for several moments. For 25 years, I had imagined this exact moment. The opportunity to clear my name, to expose the truth, to confront the people who destroyed my life. But something unexpected happened as I looked at those documents. I didn't feel anger, I felt patience. Because the truth had waited for 25 years. And if it had waited that long, it could wait a little longer. Margaret asked me a question before I left that day. "When do you want to reveal this?" I thought about Michael. My son had spent his entire adult life believing his mother was a criminal. If the truth suddenly appeared in court documents, he might think it was simply a legal maneuver. But if he heard the truth directly from me, the impact would be very different. So I told Margaret the same thing I later told Daniel. "Not yet." And then something unexpected happened. A few months later, my phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to my son. He was getting married, and he wanted the world to see the woman he believed had ruined his life. What Michael Grant didn't realize was that the wedding he planned to use as my humiliation was about to become the moment the truth finally walked into the room. When Michael called and told me about the wedding, I understood something immediately that he probably didn't realize himself. This invitation wasn't about reconciliation. It was about control. For 25 years, my son had lived with a version of the story that had been carefully crafted by two people, his father Richard Grant and his grandmother Victoria Grant. In their version, I was the woman who had betrayed the family, destroyed a successful company, and disappeared because I couldn't face the consequences. And now Michael Grant had grown into a successful corporate attorney who wanted to prove himself worthy of his fiancée's world. Claire Davenport came from one of the most respected investment families in the region. Her parents were influential, wealthy, and very protective of their reputation, which meant one thing. Michael didn't want them to discover the truth accidentally. He wanted to control the narrative. So instead of hiding me completely, he had chosen a different strategy. Expose me, introduce the woman everyone had heard about. Let them see the disgraced mother with their own eyes. In Michael's mind, that would close the chapter forever. But there was something my son didn't understand about patience. When you have lived through public humiliation, you learn to recognize the difference between revenge and timing. And timing was exactly what I had been waiting for. The morning after Michael's call, Daniel Reyes arrived at my office with a folder under his arm. Daniel had been quietly investigating the old Grant logistics case for months, and by that point he already knew what the wedding invitation meant. "So it's finally happening," he said as he sat down across from me. "Yes," I replied, "and he expects you to walk into that room as the villain." "That's the plan." Daniel leaned back slightly. "Are you going to stop it?" I shook my head. "No," he looked surprised. "Why not?" I stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. From that height the buildings looked small, almost quiet. 20 years earlier I had been cleaning offices in buildings like these after midnight. Now several of them belong to my company. "Because sometimes people need to see something with their own eyes," I said. Daniel followed my gaze. "You're planning something?" "Not something," I replied. "Truth." He nodded slowly. By the time he left the office, the first pieces of preparation had already begun. Later that afternoon, I visited Margaret Sloan. Margaret was the only lawyer I trusted with the documents Daniel had uncovered. Her office was located inside a tall glass building downtown, and when I arrived, she was already waiting with several files open on her desk. "These are the final verified records," she said as she handed me a thick folder. Inside were copies of the financial transactions that had destroyed my life 25 years earlier. Transfers signed by Richard. Executive approvals hidden during the investigation. Internal communications showing that Victoria Grant had personally arranged for certain documents to disappear before the trial. Margaret watched me carefully as I turned the pages. "This evidence is strong enough to reopen the case," she said. "If we file now, we could start the legal process within weeks." I closed the folder slowly. "Not yet," Margaret didn't argue. She had known me long enough to understand that when I waited, there was always a reason. "You're planning to reveal this at the wedding," she said. "Yes, publicly, calmly." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "That will create a storm." I allowed myself a small smile. "I've lived through worse." She nodded and placed the documents back into the folder. "Then we'll keep everything prepared. When you give the signal, we move." As I left Margaret's office that afternoon, I realized something that surprised even me. I wasn't nervous. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to face Richard and Victoria again. But now that the moment was approaching, the emotion I felt most strongly wasn't anger. It was clarity. Because the wedding wasn't just another family event, it was a stage. Michael believed he had invited me to play the role of the disgraceful mother, but he had forgotten something very important. Stories change when the truth finally appears. That evening, Daniel called again. "There's something else you should know," he said. "What is it?" "I did a little research on the Davenport family, Claire Davenport's family, and," I asked, "they're extremely protective of their public image." "That doesn't surprise me. But here's the interesting part," Daniel continued. "Claire herself doesn't seem entirely convinced by the story about you." That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" "She asked questions about the old case recently," Daniel explained. "Apparently she couldn't find many records supporting the accusations." I smiled slightly. Claire Davenport might have grown up in a wealthy world, but curiosity is something no family reputation can control. And curiosity often leads to truth, which meant the wedding reception was about to become far more interesting than Michael expected. 2 days later, Daniel called again with another update. "The guest list is large," he said. "Business leaders, attorneys, investors, half the city's elite will be there." Michael had chosen the audience carefully. If he was going to present his version of the story, he wanted important people watching. That only made the situation more useful, because when the truth finally appears, the size of the audience matters. The evening before the wedding, I stood alone in my dressing room looking at the invitation card Michael had sent. The paper was thick and expensive. Everything about the event had been designed to impress. But the detail that interested me most wasn't the venue, it was the timing. The ceremony began at 3 in the afternoon. The reception started immediately afterward, which meant the room would be full of guests when the moment arrived. I placed the invitation down and picked up my phone. Daniel answered on the second ring. "Everything ready?" I asked. "Yes." "And Margaret, she's prepared." I looked at my reflection in the mirror. 25 years ago, I had been dragged through a courtroom while reporters called me a criminal. Tomorrow, I would walk into a wedding where my own son expected to humiliate me. But something about that moment felt strangely peaceful, because I knew something he didn't. The woman he invited to shame in front of his guests was not the same woman he believed existed. And when the car finally pulled up to that wedding hall the next afternoon, the entire room would realize just how wrong they had been. The morning of the wedding arrived quietly. No dramatic music, no racing thoughts. Just the calm feeling that comes when a moment you've waited years for finally reaches you. I woke early, as I always do. Old habits never leave you. When you've spent years rebuilding your life piece by piece, discipline becomes part of your bones. The city outside my window was just beginning to wake up. Traffic moved slowly below, and the morning light reflected against the glass buildings across the street. I made a cup of tea and sat at the small table near the window. Today my son planned to humiliate me. And strangely enough, I wasn't angry about it anymore, because anger rushes, truth waits. By late morning, my phone rang. It was Daniel Reyes, the private investigator who had spent months helping me uncover the truth about the scandal that destroyed my life. "Everything's ready," he said. Daniel had always been a man of few words, but those three carried weight. "Margaret?" I asked. "She's prepared," he replied. Margaret Sloan, the corporate litigation lawyer who held the documents proving my innocence, had agreed to attend the wedding quietly as a guest. She wouldn't say anything unless I asked. But if the moment arrived, the truth would not be standing alone. I thanked Daniel and ended the call. Then I stood and walked toward the wardrobe where my suit was hanging. For 25 years, people had imagined what a leaner Grant looked like now. They probably pictured someone tired, someone defeated, someone who had spent decades hiding in shame. Instead, I put on a dark tailored suit that fit perfectly. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just simple elegance. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I didn't see the woman who had once been dragged through courtrooms and newspapers. I saw the woman who survived it. Around noon, a car arrived outside the building. Daniel had arranged it, not because I needed luxury, but because appearances speak loudly in rooms full of powerful people. The driver stepped out and opened the door. "Mrs. Grant," he said politely. The ride to the venue took about 30 minutes. During the drive, I looked out the window and allowed myself to remember something I had spent years trying not to think about. Michael, as a little boy, he used to sit beside me at the kitchen table doing homework while I balanced the household accounts. He loved numbers. Sometimes he would look up and say, "Mom, numbers always tell the truth, don't they?" I used to smile and tell him yes. Numbers always tell the truth. What I didn't know back then was that one day numbers would also prove my innocence. The car finally turned onto a long, tree-lined driveway. At the end of the road stood the wedding venue. It was exactly what I expected. Large white columns, perfectly trimmed gardens, luxury cars already filling the parking area. Michael had chosen a place designed to impress the kind of people Claire Davenport's family respected. As the car rolled to a stop, I could already see guests gathering near the entrance. Expensive suits, elegant dresses, the kind of crowd that measures success quietly but carefully. The driver stepped out and opened the door. For a moment, I remained seated, not because I was afraid, but because I understood something very important. The moment I stepped out of that black Bentley, the story everyone believed about me would begin to change. I took a slow breath. Then I stepped outside. Conversations nearby slowed almost immediately. People glanced toward the car first, then toward me. Some of them recognized the name Grant. Others simply noticed that someone unfamiliar had arrived. I walked calmly toward the entrance. Inside, the wedding preparations were already in full motion. Music played softly, guests mingled around small tables. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying glasses of champagne. And standing near the center of the room was my son. Michael Grant looked exactly as I remembered him, only older, taller, more confident. He was speaking with Claire Davenport and several members of her family. Claire looked elegant in a white dress, surrounded by relatives who carried the quiet confidence of generational wealth. For a moment, none of them noticed me. Then Michael turned. And the moment he saw me, everything stopped. His expression froze. Shock, confusion, something else too, something deeper. For 25 years, my son had imagined the woman who ruined his family. The broken woman, the ashamed woman, but that wasn't the woman standing in front of him. The room around us began to grow quieter. Guests were noticing the tension. Michael slowly walked toward me. "What are you doing here?" he asked quietly. His voice carried more emotion than he probably intended. I held his gaze calmly. "You invited me." The words were simple, but they echoed through the silence that had formed around us. Across the room, I noticed two other faces watching carefully: Richard Grant, my ex-husband, and Victoria Grant, the matriarch who had worked so hard to erase me from this family's history. Victoria's eyes narrowed the moment she saw me. Richard looked pale. Claire Davenport stepped slightly closer to Michael, studying me with quiet curiosity. She had heard the stories about me, but now she was seeing the person those stories described, and something about the comparison clearly didn't match. Michael straightened his posture. "This isn't necessary," he said quietly, trying to regain control of the moment. "You made it necessary," I replied calmly. The silence in the room grew heavier, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone, because I knew something the rest of the room didn't. This moment was only the beginning, and before the evening was over, everyone in that room would finally learn the truth about what really happened 25 years ago. The room remained silent after Michael asked why I had come. For a moment, it felt as if the entire reception hall had frozen in time. Champagne glasses stopped halfway to lips. Conversations faded into uneasy whispers. Even the music playing in the background suddenly felt too loud for the tension filling the room. Michael stood in front of me, his jaw tight, trying to keep control of a situation that was slipping away from him. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, but the strain in his voice made the words carry farther than he intended. Several guests turned openly now. Claire Davenport, my son's bride, watched the exchange carefully. Unlike the others, she didn't look angry or embarrassed. She looked curious, and curiosity can be dangerous when a lie has been protecting itself for years. I kept my voice calm. "You invited me, Michael?" "I invited you so people could see the truth," he replied quickly. A faint murmur moved through the room. That sentence alone revealed more about his intentions than he probably realized. Before I could respond, another voice cut through the air. "That's enough, Victoria Grant." Even at 84, she still carried the commanding presence of someone who had controlled a family for decades. She slowly stepped forward, her eyes fixed on me with the same cold calculation I remembered from 25 years ago. "This woman should not be here," she said sharply, addressing the room as much as me. "Everyone here deserves to know exactly who she is." Michael remained silent. That told me everything. This was exactly how he expected the moment to unfold. Victoria continued. 25 years ago, this woman destroyed our family business through fraud and greed. She betrayed her husband and abandoned her child when she was exposed. Gasps rippled through the guests. Claire's parents exchanged uncomfortable looks. Claire herself glanced from Victoria to me, waiting. I felt no urge to interrupt, because sometimes the fastest way to expose a lie is to let it speak completely. Victoria pointed at me. "And now she has the audacity to appear here and pretend she belongs in this family." Her voice rose with anger. "You were convicted in court. A jury proved what you did." Several guests nodded quietly. The narrative they had heard their entire lives was being reinforced. I waited until Victoria finished. Then I spoke. "Are you done?" The question surprised her. She blinked once, clearly not expecting calm. I turned slowly, making sure my voice carried clearly across the room. "For 25 years," I said quietly, "that story has followed me everywhere." I paused. "But stories and truth are not always the same thing." Michael's expression hardened. "You're still lying," he said. "I'm not here to argue," I replied. Then I looked toward the back of the room. "Margaret?" Heads turned as Margaret Sloane stepped forward from among the guests. She moved with quiet confidence, holding a leather folder in her hands. Victoria's eyes narrowed immediately. "Who is this?" Margaret stopped beside me. "My name is Margaret Sloane," she said clearly. "Corporate litigation attorney?" The room grew quieter. Margaret opened the folder slowly. "I have spent the last year reviewing the original financial records from Grant Logistics," she continued. "Records that were not presented during the original trial." A wave of whispers moved through the crowd. Richard Grant, my former husband, had gone pale. Michael looked confused. "What records?" he asked. Margaret calmly removed several documents and held them up. "Executive authorization records, debt transfers, internal financial approvals." She turned the pages toward the crowd. "All signed by Richard Grant?" The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it. Michael turned toward his father. "Dad," Richard didn't answer. Margaret continued. "These documents prove that the financial decisions which led to the company's collapse were authorized directly by the executive office." She paused. "Not by Alina Grant?" Claire's hand slowly covered her mouth. Victoria's expression hardened instantly. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Fabricated nonsense." Margaret didn't raise her voice. "These documents were recovered from archived financial records and verified through multiple accounting databases." Then she added one final sentence. "And we also have sworn testimony from a former internal auditor who confirmed the records were removed from the investigation before the trial." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Michael slowly turned toward his father again. Richard's shoulders had sunk. For the first time in 25 years, he looked small. Dad, Michael said again, his voice shaking. Richard finally spoke. I didn't have a choice. The words barely escaped his mouth. Victoria turned toward him sharply. Richard, but it was too late. Michael stared at his father like he had never seen him before. You blamed her, he asked quietly. Richard couldn't meet his eyes. The room erupted into whispers. Claire looked between all of us, clearly trying to understand how an entire family history had just collapsed in front of her. Then she asked the simplest question in the room. Michael, did you ever check the records yourself? Michael didn't answer because deep down he knew the truth. He had never questioned the story he was told. He had simply believed it. For 25 years, I looked at my son. Not with anger, not with triumph, just with patience. Because the truth had finally arrived. And once truth enters a room, it never leaves the same way. For several long seconds after Richard spoke, no one in the room moved. The wedding hall that had been filled with music and celebration just minutes earlier now felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been delivered. Michael stood in the center of it all, staring at his father as if the ground beneath his life had suddenly shifted. You blamed her, he repeated quietly. Richard still wouldn't meet his eyes. Victoria Grant stepped forward quickly, trying to regain control of the moment she had ruled for decades. This is nonsense, she snapped. Old documents and accusations don't change what happened. But her voice didn't carry the same power it once had, because something had already changed in the room. People were no longer listening to her. They were watching Michael. My son slowly turned toward me. For the first time since I had arrived, the anger in his eyes had faded. In its place was something much more painful. Confusion. For 38 years he had lived with a story that explained everything. Why his mother disappeared, why the family never spoke about her, why his childhood had that quiet, empty space where a mother should have been. And now that story had collapsed in front of hundreds of witnesses. Is it true? He asked softly. He wasn't asking Margaret anymore, he was asking me. I held his gaze. Yes, the single word carried 25 years of silence behind it. I never stole from the company, I continued calmly. I never betrayed your father, and I never abandoned you. Across the room, Claire Davenport was watching every word carefully. The woman who had once believed the rumors about me now looked like someone seeing an entirely different story unfold. Michael's voice dropped to a whisper. Then why didn't you come back? The question hit harder than anything else that had happened that evening. Because that question belonged to the little boy he used to be, I answered honestly. Because every door was closed to me. The room remained quiet as I continued. Your grandmother made sure the story about me spread everywhere. No one would hire me, no one would listen. And every time I tried to reach you, I was told you didn't want to hear from me. Michael's eyes slowly shifted toward Victoria. Victoria didn't look away. But for the first time, she didn't speak either. Margaret Sloane stepped forward once more. There will likely be a formal review of the case, she said calmly. The evidence we've uncovered is more than enough to reopen the investigation. Several guests whispered again. Richard sank into a chair as if the weight of the years had suddenly caught up with him. But the moment was no longer about him, or Victoria. It was about Michael. He stood there for several long seconds, breathing slowly, trying to rebuild an understanding of his own life in real time. Finally, he turned toward Claire. I didn't know, he said. Claire nodded gently. I believe you, she replied. Then she looked at me, not with anger, not with judgment, but with quiet respect. You should sit down, she said softly. You've carried this for a long time. It was a simple gesture, but sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest dignity. Michael looked back at me one more time. I spent my whole life believing you destroyed our family, he said quietly. I know, his voice cracked slightly. I invited you here to prove it. And instead, I replied gently, you learned the truth. The room slowly began to breathe again. Guests started speaking in low voices. Some were still stunned. Others looked embarrassed to have believed the old story for so many years. But I wasn't there for them. I turned to leave. Michael noticed immediately. You're going? He asked. Yes, you waited 25 years for this moment. I didn't wait for revenge, I said. I waited for truth. He stepped closer. There were still too many emotions in his eyes for any of them to fully settle. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. You don't have to fix it today, I said gently. Then I placed my hand lightly on his shoulder. But now you know where the story really begins. For the first time that evening, Michael didn't pull away. As I walked toward the exit, I noticed Daniel Reyes standing quietly near the back of the room. He gave me a small nod. Margaret Sloane followed shortly behind. Outside, the evening air felt calm, peaceful. The same world that had once believed I was a criminal had finally heard the truth. Not shouted, not forced, simply revealed. As the car door closed and the venue lights faded behind us, I realized something important. For 25 years, people had called me many things: a disgrace, a criminal, the woman who destroyed a family, but none of those names had ever been true, and in the end, truth didn't need to rush. It simply waited until the right moment to stand up and be seen. And when it finally did, the room that expected humiliation instead witnessed something far more powerful: a woman who refused to be broken.